Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we explore the most spine-chilling and mysterious tales to haunt your nights. Tonight, we delve into the eerie legends of sinister snowmen, from glowing red eyes in the night to snowmen that move when no one's watching. These 5 terrifying Christmas tales will make you think twice before building one in your yard. Dim the lights, grab a warm blanket, and prepare for a frosty dose of fear this holiday season. Story number 1. I remember the Christmas Eve that changed everything. The night when the quiet peace of our suburban life was shattered by something beyond understanding. We had moved to the outskirts of New York City earlier that year, trading the relentless pace of urban life for the tranquil rhythms of a small town. Our new home was a charming 2-story house with a spacious front yard, a perfect canvas for winter festivities. The snow had been falling steadily all afternoon, blanketing the neighborhood in a pristine layer of white. My wife, Laura, and our 2 children, Sophie and Max, were brimming with excitement. "Dad, can we build a snowman?" Max asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. I glanced at Laura, who smiled and nodded. "Sure thing, buddy," I replied. "Let's make the biggest one this town has ever seen." We bundled up in our warmest clothes and stepped into the frosty air. The snow was perfect, soft but packable. Together, we rolled 3 enormous snowballs, each one larger than the last. Lifting them into place was a family effort, filled with laughter and a few playful snowball fights. Sophie found 2 smooth, black stones for the eyes, and Max proudly donated a large carrot for the nose. Laura added a scarf and an old hat to complete the ensemble. "He's perfect," she declared, stepping back to admire our handiwork. As dusk settled, the sky turned a deep indigo, and the first stars began to twinkle. We retreated inside, cheeks flushed and spirits high. The aroma of hot cocoa filled the house as we gathered around the fireplace, the warmth seeping into our bones. "That was fun," Laura said, snuggling against me on the couch. "Best snowman ever," Max agreed, his eyelids drooping. "Time for bed, kiddos," I announced, after tucking them in. Laura and I settled in for a quiet evening. The glow of the Christmas tree filled the living room with a soft, golden light. Everything felt right, until, around midnight, a strange noise pulled me from a light doze. It was a faint crunching sound, like footsteps pressing into fresh snow. I sat up, listening intently. "Did you hear that?" Laura whispered, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Probably just an animal," I replied, though unease coiled in my stomach. We both fell silent as the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from just outside the front window, curiosity getting the better of me. I moved to the window and parted the curtains slightly. The porch light cast a pale circle onto the snow, but at first, I saw nothing amiss. Then my gaze shifted to the snowman. "Laura," I called softly, "come here." She joined me, and together we stared in disbelief. The snowman's eyes, once simple black stones, now glowed a sinister red. They seemed to flicker, casting an eerie light onto the snow beneath. "Is that real?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It must be a reflection," I reasoned, though I didn't believe it. As we watched, the snowman's head tilted ever so slightly in our direction. The glowing eyes remained fixed on us, unblinking. Did it just move? Laura grabbed my arm. "It's probably the wind," I suggested, but the words felt hollow. A sudden tap on the window pane made us both jump. It was subtle, like the peck of a bird, but insistent. Then another, and another. "Maybe it's kids playing a prank," I said, more to reassure myself than anything else. Laura shook her head. At this hour, I decided to step outside and investigate. Grabbing my coat and a flashlight, I told Laura to stay inside. "Be careful," she urged. The cold air hit me like a slap as I stepped onto the porch. My breath billowed in front of me as I scanned the yard. Everything was still, the world muffled by the snow. I approached the snowman cautiously, close, The red glow of its eyes was even more unsettling. They seemed to bore into me, alive with some inner fire. I reached out and touched one of the stones. It was cold, just a regular rock. The glow intensified for a moment, and I snatched my hand back. "This is ridiculous," I muttered. "It's just a snowman." Turning to head back inside, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Footprints, large and deep, circled the snowman and led toward the woods behind our house. They weren't there when we'd finished building earlier. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice echoing into the darkness. No response. I followed the tracks a few steps before a sense of dread pulled me back. Something about them was off. They were too big, the stride too long for any human. Retreating to the safety of the house, I locked the door behind me. "Well?" Laura asked. "Nothing. Probably just animals." I lied. She studied me, concern etched on her face. "Let's just go to bed." Sleep did not come easily. I lay awake, listening for any sound, but the night remained quiet. Morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky. The events of the previous night felt like a strange dream. Over breakfast, Max looked up from his cereal. "Dad, where's the snowman?" "What do you mean?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "He's gone." I exchanged a glance with Laura before we all hurried outside. The spot where the snowman had stood was empty, just a rough mound of disturbed snow. "Did it melt?" Sophie asked. "Overnight? In these temperatures?" Laura replied, her eyes wide. The footprints I'd seen the night before were still there, more pronounced in the daylight. They led away from the yard and disappeared into the dense forest. "Stay here," I instructed, following the tracks once more. The footprints continued deeper into the woods, each one pressed firmly into the snow. The trees closed in around me, their bare branches like skeletal arms. After several minutes, the tracks abruptly stopped in a small clearing. In the center stood a crude snowman, smaller than before but unmistakable. His eyes glowed red. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran through me. I took a step back, my mind racing. "This isn't possible," I whispered. A rustling sound came from behind me. I spun around, but saw nothing. The forest was silent, yet I felt watched. "Time to go," I told myself. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely discernible. "Stay!" I broke into a run, stumbling through the snow until I burst from the woods into our backyard. "Dad, are you okay?" Max called. "I'm fine," I lied, gasping for breath. Back inside, I tried to make sense of it all. Was someone playing an elaborate prank? But who would go to such lengths? Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. At night, we'd hear soft tapping on the windows. Distant whispers carried on the wind. Objects in the house seemed to move on their own. A door left open, picture frame tilted. Laura grew increasingly anxious. "We should call the police," she suggested. "And tell them what? That a snowman is stalking us?" I retorted. "Something is not right. I can feel it." She was right. There was a presence, an unseen force that seemed to be closing in. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, the lights flickered and went out. "Great, a power outage." I grumbled. "I'll get the candles," Laura offered. The kids huddled close as we illuminated the room with a soft glow. A heavy thud sounded from the front porch. "What was that?" Sophie whispered. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I knew better. Another thud, louder this time. "I'll check it out." "No!" Laura grabbed my arm. "Don't go. We can't just ignore it." I moved cautiously to the front door, peering through the peephole. First, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, a glowing red light rose into view, stopping at eye level. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" Laura asked, fear evident in her voice. It's here." The doorknob began to rattle, a gentle at first, then more violently. "Everyone, upstairs. Now!" We raced to the second floor, barricading ourselves in the master bedroom. The sounds of the house creaking and groaning filled the air, as if it were alive. "What's happening? Dad?" Max's eyes filled with tears. "Everything's going to be okay," I assured him, though I didn't believe it. The tapping resumed, this time on the bedroom window. The curtains fluttered despite the windows being closed. I knew we couldn't stay there. "Follow me," I instructed. We moved to the attic, climbing the narrow staircase. It was dusty and filled with boxes, but there were no windows, a safe haven. "Stay quiet," I whispered. We huddled together in the darkness, the only sound our ragged breathing. Minutes passed like hours. Then, from below, a slow, deliberate creaking of footsteps ascending the stairs. Laura squeezed my hand. "It can't be." I looked around for anything that could be used as a weapon but found nothing. The footsteps reached the attic door, which shuddered as something pushed against it. "Daddy!" Sophie's voice was barely audible. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but shadow. A shape emerged, a figure made of snow, taller than any man, his eyes burning like embers. It moved without sound, gliding toward us. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, desperation giving me courage. Paused, tilting its head as if contemplating. "Leave us alone," Laura screamed. The creature extended an arm, fingers like icicles reaching out. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing a metal rod from an old wardrobe. I swung with all my might, the rod passing through the creature's form and hitting the floor with a clang. A hissing sound filled the air as the creature began to dissolve, melting into a puddle of water that seeped into the floorboards. We stared in disbelief. "Is it over?" Max asked. Before I could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost spread across the walls, and from the puddle, the creature began to reform. "We have to get out of here," I realized, clambering down the attic ladder. We made our way to the garage. I fumbled with the keys, my hands numb. "Come on, come on," I muttered. The car roared to life, and we sped away from the house, the silhouette of the snowman visible in the rearview mirror, its eyes watching us depart. We drove to a motel on the outskirts of town. Exhausted and terrified, we huddled together in a single room. The next day, we contacted the authorities, but our story was met with skepticism. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of any intruder. Perhaps it was a wild animal, the officer suggested. We knew better, deciding that we couldn't return. We made arrangements to move. As we packed our belongings under the watchful eyes of movers, I felt a lingering unease. On our last night in town, I took a final drive past the old house. The new owners were already moving in. Children played in the front yard, laughing as they built the snowman. My heart sank. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There, standing among the trees, was a tall figure with glowing red eyes. It lifted a hand, as if in farewell, or a promise. To this day, I don't know what we encountered. A spirit? A manifestation of something ancient and malevolent? All I know is that it found us, and it hasn't let go. Every winter, when the first snow falls, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. I watch my children closely, cautioning them to stay away from snowmen, because some things are more than they seem, and some stories are warnings disguised as memories. If you ever see a snowman with eyes that seem to glow, turn away. Do not engage. Do not invite it into your life, because once you do, it may follow you forever. Story number 2. I never thought I'd return to Whittier, Alaska, not after all these years, not after what happened, but sometimes the past has a way of pulling you back, like a riptide dragging you into cold, dark waters. It was the Christmas of '98 when I was a young man, full of ambition and eager to leave my small-town roots behind. Whittier was a place where secrets were buried under layers of ice and snow, and the nights were long and unforgiving. The entire town lived in a single, towering building, Beach Towers, an old Cold War relic that housed everyone and everything. It was as if the isolation wasn't just physical but seeped into our very souls. I was working at the local general store, saving up to move to the lower 48. The days were short, and the nights seemed endless. Around Christmas, the darkness would stretch for nearly 20 hours a day. The townsfolk tried to keep spirits high, decorating the common areas with lights and tinsel. But there was an undercurrent of unease that no amount of festive cheer could erase. "Have you heard the laughter?" Old Bill asked me one evening as I was stocking shelves with canned goods. "Laughter," I replied, not looking up. "From the Snowmen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I chuckled. "Snowmen don't laugh, Bill." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes bore into mine, wide and bloodshot. "They do here, especially under the moonlight." I pulled away gently. "Maybe you've been hitting the bottle a little early today." He shook his head vehemently. "Mark my words, Alex, stay indoors at night. Don't go wandering near the town square." I brushed it off as the ramblings of a lonely old man. But that night, as I made my way back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his words had stirred. The wind howled through the corridors of Beach Towers, and the building creaked like an old ship at sea. A few days later, on Christmas Eve, the town held its annual festival. Children and adults alike gathered in the square outside, bundled up against the biting cold. We built snowmen, each one more elaborate than the last. Some had scarves and hats. Others had buttons and twig arms. The laughter of children echoed through the frigid air, a rare warmth in the perpetual night. "Looks like a good turnout this year," Sarah said, sidling up next to me. She was a local schoolteacher, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. "Yeah," I agreed, packing snow onto the base of a particularly large snowman. Nice to see everyone in good spirits. As the evening wore on, the festivities moved indoors, where hot cocoa and spiced cider awaited. I stayed behind to finish up, enjoying the solitude. The square was illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps, casting long shadows across the snow. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle carried on the wind. I paused, looking around. The square was empty, the snowmen standing sentinel in the silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice muffled by the scarf around my neck. No response. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion, and turned to head inside. Then, another giggle, this time more distinct. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, but with a distorted edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced back at the snowman. For a moment, I could have sworn one of them had turned its head slightly in my direction. I blinked, and everything appeared normal again. "Get a grip, Alex," I muttered to myself. I quickened my pace toward the entrance of the building. As I reached for the door, I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on snow behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The snowmen stood as they had before, but something was off. The one closest to me seemed closer. Hadn't it been further away just moments ago? My heart began to race. The wind picked up, whistling eerily through the narrow alleys between buildings. Must be the darkness playing tricks, I thought, but deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building. Around 2 a.m., a soft tapping sound echoed through my small apartment. First, I thought it was the radiator, but the tapping became more insistent. I sat up, my breath visible in the cold air. The sound was coming from the window, gathering what little courage I had. I walked over and pulled the curtain aside. There, standing on the fire escape, was a snowman. It was impossible. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. The snowman wore a crooked grin, its coal eyes glinting with a sinister light. Its twig arm was raised, the stick lightly tapping against the glass. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, it was gone. Only the swirling snow met my gaze. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I confided in Sarah. I think I'm losing my mind. I admitted over a cup of bitter coffee in the communal kitchen. She studied me carefully. Did you hear the laughter? I looked up sharply. You too. She nodded slowly. Last year, one of my students claimed a snowman followed him home. We all dismissed it as a child's imagination. But now, I don't know. What's going on here? Sarah? She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. There's a local legend. They say that during the Klondike Gold Rush, a group of miners got lost in a blizzard near here. They froze to death. Their bodies never recovered. Some believe their spirits wander during the long nights of winter, latching onto the snowmen we build. That's just a ghost story, I scoffed, though unease gnawed at me. Is it? She challenged. Can you explain what you saw? I couldn't. Over the next few days, more reports surfaced. People heard unsettling laughter when no one was around. Some claimed objects in their homes had been moved. One man swore that a snowman appeared in his backyard overnight, even though he lived alone and hadn't built one. The town's jovial atmosphere turned to one of quiet dread. The residents avoided going out after dark, and the snowmen in the square stood untouched, their cheerful appearance now menacing. One evening, I decided enough was enough. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, or perhaps foolishness, I ventured out into the square. The sky was clear, the full moon casting an otherworldly glow over everything. I'm not afraid of you, I called out, my voice echoing. Silence. I walked up to the largest snowman, the one I had helped build. His grin seemed to mock me. You're just snow and sticks, I muttered, reaching out to push it over. Before I could touch it, a cold gust of wind whipped around me, and I heard that chilling giggle once more. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but the beam reflected off the snow, blinding me momentarily. When my vision cleared, the snowman had changed position. His head was now tilted to the side. As if observing me, I stepped back, tripping over my own feet and falling into the snow. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to get up. Leaving so soon? A voice whispered, though no one was there. I didn't wait to find out more. I ran back to the building, my lungs burning from the cold air. Inside, I found old Bill sitting in the lobby, a knowing look in his eyes. You saw them, didn't you? He said. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed. They've been here longer than any of us. Best to leave them be. Why doesn't anyone do anything? I demanded. We can't live like this. What would you have us do? He replied wearily. Fight the snow. I spent the next few days holed up in my apartment, avoiding any contact. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their grinning faces. On New Year's Eve, the town tried to reclaim its spirit with a small celebration in the community hall. I was reluctant to go, but Sarah convinced me. Maybe being around others will help, she suggested. The hall was decorated festively, but the energy was subdued. Conversations were hushed, and laughter was forced. Around midnight, the lights flickered and went out. Nervous murmurs filled the room. Probably the generator, someone said. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of snow crunching underfoot, coming from just outside the hall. The windows were frosted over, obscuring our view. A collective tension gripped us. No one moved. A loud thud resounded as something heavy hit the door. The doorknob rattled, and the door creaked open slowly. There stood a snowman, larger than any I'd seen before, filling the doorway, its arms stretched unnaturally long, twigs clawing at the air. The coal eyes burned with an inner fire, and that grin, wider than ever. Screams erupted as people scrambled to the back of the hall. The snowman stepped forward, leaving wet footprints on the wooden floor. Behind it, more figures emerged, all made of snow yet moving with deliberate intent. I grabbed Sarah's hand. We have to get out of here. We pushed through a side door. the freezing air hitting us like a wall. The town was overrun. Snowmen advanced from every direction, their movements jerky yet purposeful. "This can't be happening," Sarah whimpered. We dashed toward Beejich Towers, the only sanctuary we knew. Others followed, a frantic stampede through the snow. Inside, the residents barricaded the entrances. The building shook as the snowmen battered against the walls. "How do we stop them?" I shouted to anyone who would listen. Old Bill stepped forward, a solemn expression on his face. "We can't, but maybe we can appease them." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. He took a deep breath. "They want acknowledgement. Every year, we forget about them, and every year, they remind us. We need to honor those lost souls." "How?" Pressed. "With a ceremony, an offering, desperate and out of options." We agreed. Under Bill's guidance, we gathered items, tokens of remembrance, candles, and handwritten notes. We set up a makeshift shrine in the lobby. As we lit the candles and stood in a circle, we heard the wind die down. The pounding ceased. A heavy silence enveloped us. "Thank you," a disembodied voice whispered, echoing through the hall. We waited, holding our breaths. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Cautiously, we unblocked the entrances. The snowmen were gone. Relief washed over the town, but it was tempered by exhaustion and lingering fear. Over the following days, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but we all knew things had changed. I left Whittier shortly after, unable to shake the experiences from my mind. I moved south, far from the snow and the darkness. Years later, I received a letter from Sarah. The town continued the annual ceremony, and the incidents hadn't recurred. She invited me to visit, but I couldn't bring myself to return. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, I hear faint laughter carried on the wind, and I wonder if the spirits have followed me. I keep my distance from snowmen and avoid looking at their faces, because I know now that some legends are real, and some spirits are restless. So if you ever find yourself in a small town in Alaska during the long nights of winter, and you hear laughter when no one is around, think twice before you dismiss it. And if a snowman ever seems to move when you're not looking, don't stick around to see what happens next. Some mysteries are better left frozen in time. Story number 3. I never thought a simple snowman could turn a peaceful Christmas Eve into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was the kind of winter that wrapped our small New Hampshire town in a blanket of white. The snow piling up in drifts against the old wooden fences and along the quiet streets. The year was 1995, and I was 12 years old, spending the holidays with my best friends, Tommy, Sarah, and Jake. We lived in a tight-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights flickered on. That Christmas Eve, the snowfall was particularly heavy, and school had been canceled for the holidays. The 4 of us decided to make the most of it. "Let's build the biggest snowman ever," Tommy exclaimed, his cheeks flushed red beneath his woolen hat. Sarah grinned, her eyes sparkling. "Yeah, it'll be our guardian for the night." Jake chuckled. "A guardian snowman? I like the sound of that." I nodded, the excitement infectious. "Then let's do it." We gathered in the vacant lot at the end of Maple Street, a spot we often claimed as our own. The snow was perfect, soft but packable. With mittened hands, we rolled the base, each of us pushing until it was almost as tall as we were. The middle section was equally massive, and lifting it onto the base took all our combined strength. As twilight approached, we gave our snowman its finishing touches. Sarah provided a scarf. Tommy found some old buttons for the eyes, and Jake, ever the joker, placed a battered top hat on its head. "Wait," I said, feeling a sudden impulse. I picked up a stick and carved a broad smile beneath its button eyes. "There. Now he's friendly." Tommy laughed. "Our guardian snowman." We stood back to admire our creation. In the dimming light, the snowman cast a long shadow across the lot, his grin seeming a bit too wide, his eyes a bit too dark. All right, time to head home, Jake said, glancing at his watch. Don't want to be late for Christmas Eve dinner. We parted ways, each of us heading to our respective houses, all within a few blocks of each other. The warmth of my home was welcoming, filled with the sense of pine and baking cookies. My parents were busy preparing for the next day's festivities, and I joined them, the earlier unease forgotten. As night settled in, the wind picked up, howling softly against the windows. I was tucked into bed by 10, eager for morning to arrive. Sleep came quickly. At around midnight, I awoke to a faint tapping sound. First, I thought it was a branch scraping against the window, but then I heard it again, distinct, deliberate knocks. I sat up, heart pounding. Mom? Dad? I called out softly. No response. The house was silent. I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street was deserted, illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting off the snow. Everything appeared normal until my eyes drifted to the vacant lot. The snowman was gone. I blinked, thinking I was still dreaming, but the empty space where the massive snowman had stood was unmistakable. Only a mound of disturbed snow remained. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself that it must have collapsed or that someone had knocked it down as a prank. The tapping resumed, louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I left my room and made my way downstairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath my feet. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, reaching the door. I hesitated before peering through the peephole. No one was there. Gathering my courage, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The cold air rushed in, biting at my skin. I looked out onto the porch and saw nothing but freshly fallen snow. Then I noticed them, footprints leading up to our door, then away again, disappearing into the night. I shut the door quickly, bolting it behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone playing a joke? Had one of my friends come by? I decided not to wake my parents, convincing myself it was nothing serious. Eventually, I returned to bed, though sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. Morning came, and the events of the night felt distant, almost unreal. The excitement of Christmas took over, and soon I was unwrapping gifts with my family, laughter filling the room. After breakfast, I bundled up and headed outside, eager to meet up with my friends and share what had happened. As I walked down Maple Street, I noticed something strange. In the vacant lot, the snowman was back, but it looked different. It was larger than before, towering over the spot where we built it. The scarf Sarah had provided was now accompanied by additional hats and scarves, none of which belonged to us. The grin I'd carved seemed wider, more sinister. A knot formed in my stomach. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Hey, did you see the snowman? Jake called out, approaching me with hurried steps. Yeah, I replied. Weird, isn't it? I didn't put those extra clothes on it, he said, concern in his eyes. Me neither, and it disappeared last night. I added, before we could discuss it further. Sarah and Tommy joined us, both looking uneasy. Something strange happened last night, Sarah began, her voice shaky. My family heard knocking at our door around midnight, but when we checked, no one was there. Tommy nodded. Same at my house. My dad thought it was teenagers messing around, but there were footprints leading away. We exchanged glances, the realization settling in. You don't think, I started, that it's the snowman? Jake finished. That's crazy. Maybe, Sarah said. But how else do you explain it? We decided to investigate, approaching the snowman cautiously. We examined the additional items adorning it. There were 2 hats, a pair of gloves, and several scarves, all different styles and colors. These look familiar, Tommy said, pulling at one of the scarves. Wait, Sarah gasped. That's my brother's scarf. She yanked it off, staring at it in disbelief. Mine too, Jake said, pointing to a hat. That's my dad's. A sinking feeling overtook me. Guys, I think we need to check on our families. We rushed back to our homes. I burst through the front door, calling out for my parents. My mother appeared from the kitchen, relief washing over her face. "There you are. We've been looking all over for you," she said. "Is everything okay?" I asked, scanning the room. "Well, your father's missing his gloves and hat. We thought maybe you borrowed them." I shook my head. "No, I didn't." A sense of dread settled in. I explained what we'd found, and my mother's expression turned from confusion to alarm. "Stay here," she instructed, grabbing the phone to call the other parents. Minutes later, we all gathered at the vacant lot, the parents, my friends, and me. The adults were skeptical, but the evidence was right in front of them. "This is some kind of prank," Jake's father declared, though he didn't sound convinced. "Who would do this?" Sarah's mother questioned. As the adults discussed, I noticed something else. At the base of the snowman, the snow was tinged with red. "Look," I whispered, pointing it out to my friends. They saw it too, a faint, reddish stain mixed into the snow, trailing off into a thin line that led away from the lot. "Is that blood?" Tommy asked, his face pale. We followed the red trail, which led us around the neighborhood, stopping at each of our houses before continuing into the woods at the edge of town. The adults eventually noticed our absence and caught up with us. "What are you kids doing?" my father asked sternly. "There's a trail," I explained. "We think something's wrong." He looked down, his expression shifting as he saw the red streaks. "Everyone, go home now," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, we obeyed, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, the atmosphere was tense. My parents were on edge, whispering to each other when they thought I wasn't listening. I stayed in my room, trying to make sense of everything. Around midnight, the knocking returned louder, more urgent. My parents moved to answer it, but I stopped them. "Don't," pleaded. "Please." They hesitated but eventually decided to ignore it. The knocking persisted, accompanied by the sound of footsteps circling the house. Then came the whispering, a faint, unintelligible murmur that seemed to seep through the walls. "Call the police," my mother urged. My father picked up the phone, but the line was dead. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Our breath formed clouds in the air. "What's happening?" I whispered. A shadow passed by the window, a tall figure with an unnaturally wide grin. "The Snowman," I realized aloud. My parents stared at me, confusion and fear mingling in their eyes. "We have to leave," my father decided. We grabbed our coats and made a dash for the car. As we fumbled with the keys, figures emerged from the darkness. Snowmen, dozens of them, all with that same sinister grin, eyes hollow and dark. They advanced slowly, surrounding us. "Get in!" my father shouted. We piled into the car, locking the doors. The engine roared to life, and we sped away, the tires slipping on the icy road. In the rearview mirror, I watched as the snowmen stood motionless, their heads turning to follow us. We drove to the town center, seeking refuge at the police station. Other families were already there, Sarah's, Tommy's, Jake's, all recounting similar experiences. The authorities were skeptical but agreed to investigate. They returned hours later, reporting that they found nothing unusual, no snowmen, no footprints, no red stains, probably just kids playing pranks. One officer suggested dismissively, but we knew better. The following days were a blur. The town seemed oblivious to the horrors we'd faced. School was canceled indefinitely, and rumors spread like wildfire. One by one, families began to leave, unable to shake the unease that had settled over the community. My family was among them. We packed what we could and moved away, seeking a fresh start far from the snow-covered streets of that cursed town. Years have passed, but the memories remain vivid. Every winter, when the first snow falls, I feel a familiar chill, a reminder of the night when innocence was lost, and the line between the mundane and the supernatural blurred. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was all a figment of an overactive imagination fueled by childhood fears. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things are better left undisturbed. So, if you ever find yourself building a snowman on a quiet winter's night, be careful what you wish for, because sometimes the things we create take on a life of their own, and they might just come knocking. Story number 4. I never thought a simple walk home could shatter my sense of reality, but that cold Christmas Eve in 2003 changed everything. I was working late at the advertising agency in Manhattan, trying to wrap up a project before the holidays. By the time I left the office, the streets were quieter than usual, the city subdued under a blanket of freshly fallen snow. I decided to take the subway back to my apartment in Brooklyn. The train was nearly empty, the usual hustle replaced by a peaceful silence. As I emerged from the underground station, the icy wind bit at my cheeks, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. My usual route home took me down Maple Street, a narrow lane lined with brownstones and sparse streetlights. It wasn't the most direct path, but it was the quickest, and I'd walked it countless times without incident. That night, however, the street felt different, eerily deserted, the snow absorbing the sound of my footsteps. As I turned onto Maple Street, the dim glow of the old-fashioned street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. The silence was almost tangible, broken only by the distant hum of the city that never truly sleeps. About halfway down the block, I noticed it, a snowman standing alone under one of the flickering streetlights. That in itself wasn't unusual. Children often built snowmen in front of their homes, but something about this one was off. It stood directly beneath the lamppost, illuminated in a sickly yellow light. The snowman was taller than most, nearly 7 feet, with disproportionately long arms made of gnarled branches that ended in sharp points. Its eyes were hollow cavities, darker than the night around them, and its mouth was an exaggerated gape, as if frozen in a silent scream. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. I tried to shake off the unease. It's just a snowman, I told myself, quickening my pace. As I drew nearer, I couldn't help but keep it in my peripheral vision. The closer I got, the more the shadows played tricks on me, making it seem as though the snowman's head was slowly turning to follow my movement. "Get a grip, Emily," I muttered under my breath. I forced myself to look straight ahead, determined to ignore the unsettling figure. But as I passed under the next streetlight, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced back over my shoulder. My heart nearly stopped. The snowman was no longer under the lamppost. It had moved, or at least, it appeared closer than before. It now stood at the edge of the sidewalk, partially obscured by shadows, but unmistakably nearer. Panic began to set in. I scanned the street, looking for any sign of another person, someone who might be responsible for this bizarre prank. But the windows of the surrounding houses were dark, curtains drawn tight. The entire block seemed devoid of life. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call a friend or perhaps a cab, but my gloved fingers struggled to navigate the touchscreen. Frustrated, I shoved it back into my pocket. Just keep moving, I urged myself. I started walking again, my steps faster this time. The snow crunched loudly beneath my boots, each footfall echoing in the stillness. I resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on the end of the street where it intersected with Elm Avenue, bustling even at this hour. But the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if a pair of eyes were boring into the back of my head. Unable to resist any longer, I stole another glance behind me. The snowman was even closer. It now stood in the middle of the sidewalk, directly under another streetlight. The gaping mouth seemed wider, the dark eye sockets deeper. The twisted branches that served as arms were raised slightly, as if reaching out. A surge of fear shot through me. This wasn't possible. Snowmen don't just move. Someone had to be behind this. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing unnaturally. No response. Very funny, I added, trying to inject confidence into my tone. You can come out now. Silence. I took a tentative step backward, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure. My mind raced through rational explanations, a hidden prankster, an elaborate setup, but none seemed plausible. Suddenly, a soft rustling sound came from behind the snowman, like footsteps shuffling through snow. My breath caught in my throat. Okay, I'm leaving, I said, more to myself than anyone else. I turned and broke into a run. The cold air burned in my lungs as I sprinted down the street. The end of the block seemed miles away. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. When I finally reached Elm Avenue, I collided with a man walking his dog. Whoa, easy there, he exclaimed, steadying me. I'm sorry, I gasped. There's something back there. He looked down Maple Street, his expression skeptical. What do you mean? A snowman? It was moving toward me. He raised an eyebrow. A moving snowman? I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you, it was following me. He glanced again down the empty street, then back at me. Maybe you've had a bit too much eggnog? I shook my head vigorously. I'm not drunk. Please, just take a look. He sighed but seemed to sense my genuine fear. All right, let's check it out. Together, we walked a few steps back onto Maple Street. The snowman was gone. See? Nothing there, he said, gesturing to the vacant sidewalk. I stared in disbelief. It was right there, under that streetlight. Well, it's not there now, he replied gently. Maybe you just imagined it. I knew what I'd seen, but arguing seemed pointless. Yeah, maybe. Do you live nearby? Want me to walk you home? I considered the offer but hesitated at the thought of leading a stranger to my door. No, that's okay. I think I'll just catch a cab. Suit yourself. Take care. He continued on his way, his dog trotting beside him, leaving me alone once more. I pulled out my phone, grateful to see a signal, and ordered a rideshare. As I waited on the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted around, scanning the storefronts and alleys. Everything appeared normal, yet the unease lingered. Headlights approached, and I sighed with relief as the car pulled up. I climbed into the back seat, offering a quick greeting to the driver. Cold night. Ha, he remarked. Yeah, I replied absently, my gaze fixed out the rear window. As we drove away, I caught a final glimpse of Maple Street. For a fleeting moment, I saw it, the snowman standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the receding taillights. His head was tilted, as if watching me leave. I blinked, and it was gone. Back at my apartment, I double-locked the door and drew all the curtains. The warmth of the heater did little to dispel the chill that had settled in my bones. I tried to rationalize the experience. Perhaps it was a combination of exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of an empty street on a winter's night. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. Over the next few days, I avoided Maple Street entirely, taking longer routes to and from the subway station. Life resumed its normal pace, and the incident began to fade from immediate memory. Then, one evening after work, a colleague named Lisa invited me out for drinks. We ended up staying later than planned, and I found myself once again faced with the decision of how to get home. Come on, Maple Street is the quickest way, Lisa insisted. It's freezing out here. I hesitated but didn't want to seem irrational. All right, but let's walk fast. We turned on to Maple Street, the familiar row of brownstones lining the quiet lane. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting elongated shadows. As we walked, I kept a vigilant eye on our surroundings. Lisa chatted animatedly about office gossip, seemingly oblivious to my anxiety. Then I saw it. Halfway down the block, near the very same lamppost, stood a snowman. It was identical to the one I'd seen before, hollow eyes, gaping mouth, elongated arms made of twisted branches. I stopped abruptly. "What's wrong?" Lisa asked, noticing my pale complexion. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing ahead. She squinted. "The snowman? Yeah. What about it? Doesn't it look odd to you?" She shrugged. "It's a bit creepy, I guess. Probably some kids messing around." I wanted to turn back, but Lisa took my arm. "Come on, we're almost there." Reluctantly, I allowed her to lead me forward. As we passed the snowman, I avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the ground. A sudden rustling made us both jump. "Must be a squirrel." Lisa laughed nervously. I glanced back. The snowman's head had turned to face us. "Lisa, look!" She followed my gaze and gasped. "Did that just—" Before she could finish, the streetlight above flickered violently and went out, plunging us into semi-darkness. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted down the street, our breaths ragged and visible in the cold air. Behind us, I could hear the crunching of snow, as if footsteps were pursuing us. We reached the end of the block and darted onto the main avenue, bustling with cars and pedestrians. The sounds of the city enveloped us, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of Maple Street. "What the hell was that?" Lisa panted. "I don't know," I admitted, trembling, "but it's not the first time I've seen it." We decided to report the incident to the police. At the station, we recounted our experience to a disinterested officer. "A moving snowman?" he repeated skeptically. "You sure you ladies weren't drinking?" Lisa bristled. "We know what we saw." He sighed. "Look, we'll send a patrol car to check it out, but it's probably just a prank." Feeling dismissed, we left the station. "Maybe we're overreacting," Lisa said as we parted ways. "It could have been someone hiding inside the snowman." "Maybe," I agreed half-heartedly. That night, sleep was elusive. Every sound outside my window set me on edge. Around 3 a.m., a loud thump jolted me upright, heart pounding. I crept to the window and peeked through a slit in the curtain. There, across the street, stood the snowman. It was unmistakable, even in the dim light. A tall figure with hollow eyes and a screaming mouth. It was closer than ever, paralyzed by fear. I watched as it slowly raised one of its branch-like arms, pointing directly at me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The crash snapped me out of my stupor. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "There's someone outside my apartment," I whispered frantically. The dispatcher assured me that a unit was on its way. Minutes felt like hours. I huddled in a corner, clutching a kitchen knife for protection. A knock at the door nearly made me jump out of my skin. "Police!" A voice called. I opened the door to find 2 officers standing there. "Ma'am, we received a report of a prowler." I nodded vigorously. Across the street, a snowman. It was moving. They exchanged glances. "Let's take a look," one said. We stepped outside together. The street was empty, save for parked cars and mounds of snow. "It was right there," I insisted, pointing. One of the officers walked across the street, shining his flashlight around. "Nothing here but snowbanks," he reported. The other officer tried to reassure me. Perhaps it melted or someone took it down. "In the middle of the night?" I challenged. "Ma'am, we're happy to patrol the area, but there's not much else we can do right now." Defeated, I thanked them and returned to my apartment. The next day, I considered staying with friends or even checking into a hotel, but something compelled me to confront whatever this was. I spent hours researching, trying to find any similar occurrences. To my surprise, I stumbled upon a local legend dating back to the early 1900s, a tale of a deranged artist who built grotesque snow sculptures that seemed to come to life. According to the story, he vanished one winter, and sightings of moving snow figures began to surface thereafter. It was a stretch, but it was the only explanation that fit. Determined, I decided to destroy the snowman. That evening, armed with a shovel and a newfound resolve, I returned to Maple Street. The snowman was there, standing ominously under the streetlight. I approached cautiously, half expecting it to move. It remained still, taking a deep breath. I swung the shovel, striking the base. The snow crumbled easily. I continued until there was nothing left but a heap of displaced snow. Feeling a surge of triumph, I turned to leave. "That won't stop me," a voice whispered, barely audible over the rustling wind. I froze. Slowly, I looked back. The scattered snow began to coalesce, swirling and gathering into a vaguely human shape. Panic overtook me. I dropped the shovel and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd made a decision. Within a week, I'd broken my lease, packed my belongings, and moved out of the city. I never told anyone the full story, fearing they'd think I was insane. Years have passed, and I now live on the West Coast, far from the snow and the memories of that harrowing winter. I built a new life, one where the nights are filled with the gentle crash of ocean waves rather than eerie silence. But sometimes, on cold, clear nights, I still feel that unsettling gaze and hear the faint echo of a whisper carried on the wind. And I know that some things can't be left behind. So, if you ever find yourself walking alone on a snowy night and notice a peculiar snowman under a flickering streetlight, trust your instincts. Cross the street, turn back, do whatever you must. Just don't look back, because some figures are not what they seem. And once they've noticed you, they might just follow you home. Story number 5. I never imagined that moving to Colorado would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. My husband, David, and I decided to leave the bustle of Chicago for the serene landscapes of Boulder, hoping that the fresh mountain air would be good for our 8-year-old son, Michael. We found a charming house on the outskirts of town, a 2-story, rustic place with a spacious yard, surrounded by towering pines and the kind of tranquility we'd only dreamed of. Our first Christmas in the new house was approaching, and we were eager to make it special. The snow had fallen steadily for days, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. Michael was thrilled, spending his afternoons building forts and making snow angels while David and I decorated the house. On Christmas morning, I was awakened by Michael's excited shouts. "Mom, Dad, come look," he yelled from downstairs. David groaned beside me. "What's he gotten into now?" We threw on our robes and made our way to the living room. Michael stood by the window, his small face pressed against the glass. "There's a giant snowman in our yard," he exclaimed. I exchanged a puzzled glance with David. We hadn't built any snowmen, and as far as I knew, neither had Michael. We joined him at the window, and my breath caught in my throat. There, dominating our front yard, was a massive snowman unlike any I'd ever seen. It stood at least 10 feet tall, with a bulging body made of uneven snow mounds. Its face was grotesque, a crooked grin carved too wide, coal eyes sunk deep into misshapen sockets, and a carrot nose that curved unnaturally to the side. What unsettled me most were the arms, long, gnarled branches that jutted out at odd angles, resembling clawed hands reaching out. "Did you build that?" David asked Michael. He shook his head vigorously. "No, I just saw it now." David frowned. Maybe some kids from the neighborhood did it as a prank. I felt a shiver run down my spine. But why our yard? And how did they do it without us noticing? David shrugged. Maybe we were just too tired last night to hear anything. The day went on, and despite the odd appearance of the snowman, we tried to focus on enjoying Christmas. Michael was thrilled with his new toys, and David seemed content watching football by the fire. But I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. As evening fell, I prepared dinner while the boys set the table. The snowman loomed outside the kitchen window, its shadow stretching ominously as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Can we take it down tomorrow?" I asked David quietly. He looked up from his plate. "The snowman? Why? It just gives me the creeps." He chuckled. "It's just snow and sticks. Anna, harmless." I forced a smile. not wanting to spoil the mood. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself tossing and turning. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the bedside table. Unable to sleep, I decided to get a glass of water. As I descended the stairs, a faint scratching sound caught my attention. I paused, listening intently. It was coming from the living room window. My heart began to race. Cautiously, I approached the window and peeked through the curtains. The yard was bathed in the pale glow of the moon, casting long shadows across the snow. The snowman stood where it had been, but something was different. The right arm, the branch, was now raised, pointing directly at the house. I gasped, stumbling back. "That's not possible," I whispered to myself. "Mom?" A small voice called from behind me. I jumped, turning to see Michael rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing up?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I heard something," he mumbled. I forced a reassuring smile. "Just the wind. Sweetheart, let's get you back to bed." I tucked him in and returned to my room, debating whether to wake David. I didn't want him to think I was being irrational, but every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong. Sleep eventually overtook me, but it was restless, plagued by unsettling dreams of twisted branches and hollow eyes. The next morning, I rushed to the window, hoping that the snowman would be gone or at least returned to its original state. To my dismay, not only was the arm still raised, but the head had tilted to the side, as if watching us. "David, please," I urged over breakfast. "Can we take it down today?" He looked at me thoughtfully. "If it bothers you that much, sure. Michael and I will handle it after we eat." Relieved, I busied myself with chores while they bundled up and headed outside. From the kitchen, I watched as they approached the snowman. Michael seemed hesitant, hanging back as David inspected it. David touched the raised arm, and it snapped off easily. He tossed it aside and began to dismantle the body. As he worked, I noticed Michael staring up at the snowman's face. Unmoving, a sense of dread filled me. I stepped outside onto the porch. "Michael, honey, are you okay?" He didn't respond. "Michael," I called again. David looked over. "Hey, but give me a hand here." Michael blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. He shook his head and helped David push the middle section off the base. Within minutes, the snowman was reduced to a heap. That evening, the mood in the house was lighter. We played board games by the fire, and even I managed to relax. But as night fell, an uneasy feeling settled over me once more. Around midnight, a loud thud jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to David. He groaned softly, probably just snow falling off the roof. I wasn't convinced. Slipping out of bed, I moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain. I felt my blood run cold. The snowman was back, rebuilt exactly as before, but closer to the house, now standing just a few feet from the living room window. Both arms were raised, branches pointing upward, and the head was tilted sharply to the other side. "David," I hissed urgently. He joined me at the window, eyes widening. "What the hell? We need to call the police," I insisted. He nodded, grabbing his phone. After a brief conversation, he hung up. "They said they'll send someone over to check it out." We waited in tense silence, watching the snowman for any sign of movement. 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into our driveway. An officer stepped out, shining his flashlight around. David and I went outside to meet him. "Evening," the officer greeted. "You reported some trespassing?" We pointed to the snowman. "Someone rebuilt this overnight, right outside our window," David explained. The officer examined it, a skeptical look on his face. "Could be a prank. Kids around here sometimes get up to mischief." "In the middle of the night?" I challenged. He shrugged. "I'll file a report, but there's not much we can do unless we catch them in the act." Frustrated, we thanked him and went back inside. I double-checked all the locks before heading to bed. though sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. The next day, Michael seemed unusually quiet. He picked at his breakfast, eyes downcast. "Everything all right, honey?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Just tired." David ruffled his hair. "Maybe we should have a lazy day today." I decided to distract myself by baking cookies, hoping the familiar activity would ease my nerves. As I gathered ingredients, I glanced out the kitchen window. The snowman remained, unchanged. A movement caught my eye. For a split second, I thought I saw the branches twitch. I blinked, focusing intently, but nothing happened. That afternoon, I suggested we all go into town, maybe see a movie. David agreed eagerly, but Michael resisted. "I don't want to go," he said flatly. "Why not?" Pressed. He shrugged. "Just don't feel like it." Concerned, I exchanged a look with David. "Maybe one of us should stay with him," I suggested. David sighed. "I'll stay. You go ahead." I drove into town alone, trying to shake off the mounting anxiety. I wandered aimlessly through shops, barely registering the festive decorations and cheerful music. After a couple of hours, I headed back home. As I pulled into the driveway, a sense of dread enveloped me. The house was eerily quiet, and the snowman was nowhere to be seen. I hurried inside. "David? Michael?" No response. I checked the living room, the kitchen, then ran upstairs. The bedrooms were empty, panic rising. I grabbed my phone to call David, but his cell rang from the kitchen counter. A creaking sound echoed from the basement. My heart leaped into my throat. "David!" I called out tentatively. No answer. I found the basement door ajar, a faint light spilling out. Steeling myself, I descended the creaky steps. At the bottom, I found them. David and Michael stood facing the far wall, backs to me, motionless. Relief flooded me momentarily. "Thank God! What are you doing down here?" They didn't respond. I approached slowly. "David!" As I drew nearer, I noticed their stiff posture, their clothes dusted with snow. Reaching out, I touched David's shoulder. He was cold, too cold. He turned slowly, and I stumbled back in horror. His eyes were vacant, skin pale with a bluish tint. A chilling smile stretched across his face. "Join us," he whispered in a hollow voice. Michael turned as well, mirroring David's eerie expression. I backed away, trembling. "What's happening?" Footsteps thudded above us, heavy and deliberate. The basement door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but it was dead. "Stay with us." Their voices echoed in unison. I bolted up the stairs, banging on the door. "Let me out." The handle wouldn't budge. Behind me, their footsteps ascended, slow and methodical, desperate. I remembered the small window near the ceiling at the back of the basement. I raced toward it, clambering over old boxes. The window was tiny, but perhaps I could squeeze through. I shattered the glass with a wrench, shards cutting into my hands. Ignoring the pain, I pulled myself up and wriggled through the opening, falling into the snow outside. Gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet. The yard was enveloped in an unnatural fog, the cold seeping into my bones. The snowman stood before me, larger than ever, its arms outstretched as if to embrace me. The grotesque face seemed almost alive, eyes glinting with malevolence. Behind me, the basement door burst open. David and Michael emerged, their movements stiff and unnatural. "Stay," they called out, voices distorted. I ran toward the street, slipping and stumbling. The fog thickened, obscuring my path. I could hear them behind me, footsteps crunching in the snow. Up ahead, headlights pierced through the haze. Car was approaching. I waved frantically. "Help, please." The car screeched to a halt beside me. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, rolled down the window. "Are you all right? Please, you have to help me," I cried. He opened the door, and I scrambled inside. "What's going on?" he asked. "Just drive. Now." He sped off as I glanced back. The fog was dissipating, and the figures of David and Michael stood at the edge of the road, watching us leave. The snowman loomed behind them, his grin seeming to widen. We reached the police station, and I babbled out my story to the bewildered officers. They sent a patrol car to the house while I waited anxiously. An hour later, an officer returned. "Ma'am, we checked the property. There's no one there." "That's impossible," I protested. "They were right there." He shook his head sympathetically. "No signs of anyone. The house is empty." I insisted they search again, but the results were the same. David and Michael had vanished without a trace. Over the following weeks, searches were conducted and investigations opened. Friends and family offered their condolences, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Whispers about my mental state circulated, suggestions of stress-induced hallucinations. I knew what I'd seen, unable to bear the memories. I left Colorado, moving back to Chicago, but even there, the nightmares followed. I dreamed of the snowman, of David and Michael's lifeless eyes, of the cold that seemed to consume everything. One particularly cold winter evening, as snow blanketed the city, I returned to my apartment to find a small snowman on my doorstep. It was crudely made, but unmistakable, the same crooked grin, the same hollow eyes. A note was attached. "We miss you." My hands shook as I read it. I looked around, but the street was empty. "They're coming for me." I don't know what that thing was. A spirit, a demon, something beyond comprehension, but it took my family from me. And it won't stop until it takes me too. If you ever find a snowman in your yard that you didn't build, with a face that chills you to the core, don't ignore it. Leave, and don't look back, because some things aren't just stories told by the fireside. Some nightmares are real, and they can find you no matter where you go. Thank you for joining us on this bone-chilling journey into the darker side of Christmas. From snowmen with sinister grins to eerie footprints in the snow, these stories remind us that even the most innocent traditions can hide a sinister twist. If you enjoyed these terrifying tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more tales from the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, stay warm, and remember, when the snow falls, not everything outside is as it seems.